the whole market is speculating that in March, the Fed will begin a rate cut. And once they do rate cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are not far behind. And so the mania is about to return. The Hypnosis Songs Fund buying Taylor Swift's catalog for $1 trillion. Like, it's all coming.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Web3 and the music industry, all things NFTs, and predict a little bit ahead of what might be coming in Web3 and music. We like to do this every once in a while on the show. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is Circa, who I'm going to be picking the brain of today because this guy spends a lot of time paying attention to what's going on in the Web3 space. Cirque, what's up, dude?
Not a whole lot, dude. I'm excited for another episode of the greatest podcast on earth.
Boom, boom, boom. Me too. I'm super pumped to be here, and I'm super excited about this topic because we really only touch on this every once in a while. Last year, around this time, I think it was, we did a whole series on Web3 and music and the outlook.
It's like 2 years ago, actually.
2 years ago? Oh my gosh.
2022, yeah.
Wow, 2 years ago. We'll link to a number of those episodes in the show notes so that you guys can kind of tap in on those and see where our thoughts were at and some of the great guests that we talked to during that little arc that we did. It was really, really insightful and pretty cool. But today we want to talk about Web3, music, 2024, and kind of a little state of the union of the two of those things, and maybe a little bit about what's changed. And I'm particularly interested in hearing Cirque's outlook on a lot of this because he pays a lot more attention to the crypto space and what's going on there than I do. And I think that there's probably some stuff that might shake up the world a little bit. We had an indie on a piece of content that you shared being like, I need you guys to do a podcast episode about this. So I was excited to talk about it. But Cirque, maybe give a little recap on just what Web3 is all about and how it relates to music, or how it has related to music for anyone who's new or just has never heard the term before.
Yeah, so I think to know what Web 3 is, you got to know what Web 2 is, and thereby you got to know what Web 1 is. So Web 1 is like basically back in the days of Usenet and, you know, the early days of the internet. So back then, you basically had text files that could be hosted for other people to access. So it's pretty much just documents, right? Or scripts that like people could access across internet protocols. And websites were very, very simple. There were no elements of websites where you would interact with them necessarily. Like we had flash animations to some degree, like little things like that, but it was mostly just like read, just go there and read what's there. And then with Web 2, a few innovations came on board that changed a lot, which was like user profiles. So now you will add data to this website and its backend database, and then you'll be able to pull it up later, and all types of operations can be run on that data. So that's why we had social media, is because of Web 2. We could now create accounts on a website. We could add rich multimedia to it. And that's like the Web 2 era. And then also e-commerce is like a major part of the Web 2 era. And then basically what Web 3 is just adding blockchains to the internet, right? Blockchains are very unique in that they solve a distributed networking problem called the Byzantine generals problem, which basically means like in a distributed computer network, like I have a computer, Jack has a computer, you know, my wife has a laptop in the other room, and there's this network that like tons of people can access. How can I get a message to Jack and be sure, 100% sure, that nothing happened to that message as it was traversing through the network? How do I know someone hasn't corrupted it, hasn't accessed it, right? And so blockchains solve that problem. In fact, blockchains were like thought up in Xerox PARC back when like operating systems were thought up, back when like, you know, before like you had Mac OS, like, and folders and mouses and clicking and all this stuff. Like that's when blockchains were thought up, but they came to fruition with the invention of Bitcoin. So Yeah. So Web3 is just adding blockchain networks where we can actually transact trustlessly. We can like exchange value trustlessly and have property rights on the internet and be sure that like money won't be double spent, that the network is secure, that like nothing will be corrupted. It's a code is law environment, but for money. And so then that layer can be added to the internet so that like you might log into Twitter and you might be able to now display your digital assets that are in your blockchain wallet on Twitter, and like it's all secured by that. So Web3 is just another layer of the internet where we're adding property rights and transactions.
I think that's a helpful explainer, really briefly, of the history of the internet and also what it means to even talk about Web3. How did we go from talking about the evolution of the internet to things like cryptocurrency? How did the cryptocurrency buzz become a thing? How did the music industry come to talk about things like NFTs and rights management through Web3 and the blockchain? How did we go from this is the evolution of the internet to there's a lot of hype around stuff?
Yeah. Well, okay. So maybe it's better to like continue from where I left off, which is that like, okay, when you go on Amazon, right, and you buy something, you have a couple of parties involved. You have Amazon, the website, you have the seller, and then you also have the credit card processor. Okay. So at any point, the US government or any other entity that has power over the credit card processor or power over Amazon or power over the seller or power over you can intervene on any transaction you make on Amazon. So it's really trusted, right? You are trusting the credit card processor to access your credit card account, like, how you intended them to. You are trusting them to give Amazon and thus the seller like the right amount of money. And you are trusting that, like, you are basically trusting that there's not a massive premium being repped on your transaction. So there's lots of trust going around. Web3 is trustless protocols, which means you don't actually have to trust, you can verify, because every transaction you're doing, the math, like the what happens when I click this button, you can look it up and you can see exactly what will happen given enough like expertise in code. Or you could ask ChatGPT, like, what's going to happen if I press this button, right? So like all the logic behind those transactions and all the counterparties are known, as opposed to most Web 2 financial transactions, it's a lot of trusted parties. And so the hype became that, like, okay, for instance, like during the trucker protests in Canada, right? When the truckers were protesting, like it had something to do with COVID, I forget entirely, but like people donated to those truckers protests, like the truckers union or whatever, and those people had their bank accounts frozen for donating to like this cause. And so like that's an instance where like the government very heavily censored financial transactions for reasons that aren't like obviously virtuous, right? Like, and so you might think like, isn't that kind of tinfoil hat to be worried about like counterparties and trusted parties in a transaction? It's like, well, not really. Like, it's better if we don't probably have these things like being meddled with in this way. So that's why this layer of the internet is so important. It also means that like you don't need it removes a shitload of red tape and barriers to access for you to be a financial app as opposed to just like a social app, right? Because in the other case, you would have to like register with all these parties, you would have to get all these approvals, you would have to, integrate with a credit card network and a processor, and there would be fees taken at every single step. We can remove all that bloat, remove all those fees, and just transact between each other peer to peer. So the reason that this all became extremely attractive to the music industry, there's like the official reason, and then there's the reason that is probably more likely. The official reason it became interesting to the music industry is that there are elements of blockchain technology which give you the impression that you can take property rights as we know and love them in the real meat space world, and then you can assign property rights to digital content. And a big problem of the music industry, and we've talked about this in many, many podcast episodes, is that like intellectual property doesn't actually have property rights. Like one characteristic of property, like for instance, like this camera lens, right? This camera lens, I have property rights over it. And those property rights are strictly linked to the fact that if I'm using this right now, Jack can't use it. And if Jack takes it from me, I can't use it. Those are like very physical properties of this physical property. Those are like characteristics of property. And on the like with ideas, it's not the case. Like if I hum a ditty and Jack decides to hum the same ditty, I can still hum it, right? If Jack decides to make a bunch of copies of the ditty and then sell them, it doesn't limit my access to the ditty or my ability to do it. It has infinite reproduction capability with no degradation. So that's what's different about intellectual property. But some elements of blockchain suggest that I can take an idea and I can claim ownership of it and give it back some of the characteristics of real property. And so that became interesting. So that's the official reason that the music industry was interested, because the music industry, in terms of like red tape and barriers to access, the music industry is like the biggest venue for red tape and barriers to access, right? When someone streams a song on Spotify, it results in an allocation of Spotify's revenue being awarded to that song. In order to get that revenue to the artist's hands, it goes through 10, 20 counterparties and intermediaries. If you sell an album in a record store, this flow of money, it's like this intense, vast network of like little channels that's going to go down, and collection agencies, and all of them take a fee. And it's completely fucking unnecessary. It should not exist, right? It should not be the case that a $10 transaction gets split up 30 different ways, and each of those channels has fee extraction, rent taking coming from it. So like it gets diluted down to nothing until it gets to you. So we can remove all of that waste with this Web3 technology. We don't need all these trusted intermediaries. We can have trustless transactions. That's one of the appeals of it. That's the official reason why the music industry was interested in it. Here's the more skeptical reason. In 2020 through 2021, the US government printed 40% of all the money that is now in existence. So almost half of all the money that exists today was printed since 2020. And as a result, everyone had a lot more money, right? They didn't have more value, but they did have more money. And so they started looking for all these weird places to put that money. Because obviously, if they keep it in cash, well, cash is going down in value as they print more and more. So maybe I can put it into a hard asset that will appreciate in value, or at least stay the same value. And so they started investing in stocks, in cryptocurrencies, in real estate, in gold, in precious metals, and yes, into artwork and into music catalogs and intellectual property rights. And so this fervor came about for not only the sale of music catalogs and the overvaluation of music in general, but NFTs, where we could put art on the blockchain and now it has property rights. Intellectual property becomes physical property. And so then we were like, well, we could put music on the blockchain and we can make music NFTs. And it's just like the skeptical take is that it's just a huge grift. It's just like, it's just speculative fervor over something that might eventually have a use and be cool, but is not cool or useful yet. And it's all about flexing. You had tons of crypto millionaires who were like, if I spend 3 ETH or the equivalent of about $12,000 on this music NFT, then everyone knows I have it and I'm the owner of it and I'm a collector and it has social capital to it. So that's why it got so big. But as cryptocurrency prices depressed after the government stopped giga printing money in the end of 2021, as those prices came down, people's wealth came down and their willingness to flex by spending 12K on a music NFT also went down. And that's why everything crashed. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we are today, but it's a little bit more interesting because we're not on the outset of the crash. We were at the end of the crash and the beginning of the recovery.
That's very interesting. I love the concept of the official reason and the real reason, or the skeptical reason of what's going on here. And it's interesting how it's all tied into currency inflation and money printing, and how that eventually, how the desire for returns on essentially inflated capital funneling into crypto assets, NFTs, etc., art, music catalogs, speculative investments all led us to this place and eventually plunged us into what was, a pretty long sort of crypto winter, if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah. Do you want me to expound on that or?
No, I think you gave a really good picture of
Good.
that from kind of point 1 to, point 10.
Yeah. It's also why, like, it's important to not only look at like music NFTs as an oddity or a weird artifact of that time, but also the overvaluation of music catalogs, whereby Sony Music Publishing paid, I think it was 20 million or something, like for a Bob Dylan catalog, or maybe it was 200 million. It was a lot of money. I don't remember the exact figure, but I do remember that I calculated it out to say that in order to get their capital back, because Bob Dylan's catalog generates revenue, so it has a yearly revenue amount that it should probably generate. So when you invest in something, you want to see that if it's a yield bearing asset, if it actually gives revenue, if it has cash flows, you would want to see those cash flows return back to you the capital you invested in it over a meaningful time frame. So like, for instance, US Treasury bills right now are like 5.5%. If I go buy US Treasury bills from the government, I get 5.5% of my money back every year. And it would only take like, I think 10 years to get all of my money back and then some because of compounding interest. So the safest asset in the world, and thus the most boring and lowest yield, US Treasury bills, gets me back my money in 10 years. The investment Sony made into Bob Dylan's catalog gets them back their money in 18 years.
Long time.
Fucking nuts, dude. There's no asset you can buy that's worse than the risk-free rate of the US Treasury, except music catalogs. Literally, it's insane. So that is to say that like people companies went crazy with music catalog speculation. Investors poured money into funds that were dedicated to buying music catalogs because Goldman Sachs said, oh my God, the music industry is going to 20x in value over the next 10 years. And that's just like blatantly incorrect, right? Music is on a downward trajectory in terms of value, not on an upward one. I say all that to say that like, in the depths of the bear market, Hypnosis Songs Fund, one of the biggest funds created to buy these music catalogs, had trouble returning capital. They had trouble paying investors what they had promised in terms of dividends. They had to cut dividends. There was a big vote, this big voting like scandal. Basically, like investors were trying to vote to get Hypnosis to sell off some of its catalog. And Hypnosis like refused because the catalog is ultimately under the control of another company that they don't have shares in. Is this big fiasco. Just to say that like at the top of the bear market, when the bear market started, I said Hypnosis Songs Fund is going to become insolvent. And sure enough, like that's what appeared to be happening like as recently as 3 months ago. So it's not just music NFTs that went crazy, not just crypto that went crazy in Web3. There's also like the music industry had its own little bubble.
Right. Yeah. And it's going to be interesting to see how that specifically plays out over the next year. But I'm curious now, like you and I have talked personally about Web3 for hours upon hours of conversations between the two of us over years now, from the time that I started getting interested in it. And I'm wondering, like, from an outlook perspective of where Web3 and music is going, what has changed in your opinion about the future of that, the possibilities, the opportunities in it? Is it just a grift? Is there no future on a long enough time horizon? I think that there probably is, but I'm curious, like, where has your sort of opinion of the future and projections that we can look towards leave us compared to what we talked about maybe 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think that just like Web 2 had its own speculative fervor, right? Where everyone got way over their skis on what this stuff would mean, right? 2001.com bubble or the 2000.com bubble, where like Amazon was a company and was the future. And people were right to think it was the future, but they just got over their skis. They just got a little too excited too quickly. Okay. These things take time. And that's exactly what happens in crypto, except it happens every 4 years. Like clockwork, where like there's this massive speculative run up. To give you an example or like an anecdote that might describe it for you, last cycle, 4 years ago, Solana, which is a blockchain that's like significantly faster than every other blockchain. So blockchains can be secure, they can be decentralized, meaning like no one party is in control, and they can be fast, but they can't be all three. They can be secure and fast, secure and decentralized, or fast and decentralized, but they cannot be all three. It's called the scaling trilemma of blockchains. And Solana came out and it was fast and it was secure, but it was not very decentralized. It went from, I think, 80 cents or like roughly $2 to $260 in the span of like a year. And it had no cool apps on it. Like in terms of chains, like Ethereum as a chain has tons of cool apps, borrowing and lending protocols, games, NFTs, like all this cool stuff to do. Solana had like almost no cool apps. And it was just a kind of a ghost chain. But it became extremely valued because it can do a theoretical 10,000 transactions per second. It can rival Visa in terms of transactions per second, theoretically.
That's a helpful comparison, I think.
Yes, exactly. So people got really excited. And then it crashed from $260 down to $8 in 2022. It wasn't at 260 at the beginning of 2022, but just say that like its high was 260, it went down to $8. It is now back up at $95. It is processing transactions as fast as they thought they would. It has tons of cool apps on it, and a fairer valuation for it might be somewhere around $100. That might be a fairer valuation today, but people just got over their skis too early. And that stuff happens over and over again. So I do think Web3 is going to be a thing. I think it is the future, but we just have a little mini .com bubble every 4 years as it makes its way towards that future.
That's an interesting way to think about it for sure, and to think about the cycles and what they mean in terms of the sort of long-term outlook for Web3 and Web3 in any industry. I definitely think that's helpful. And I mean, I think for anyone who's dabbled in Web3 or DeFi or cryptocurrency, like you may have experienced some of the over the skis sort of stuff. I know I certainly did with some of the, what do we want to call them? I don't want to call them Ponzi coins.
They're Ponzi's.
Yeah.
They're yield Ponzi's. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it seems to be like without fail that like most people's introduction into Web3 is during one of these speculative bubbles. Prices get elevated enough to where normal people hear about it, they get involved, they buy at super high valuations, and then a bear market comes. They get wrecked, they wait through it, they eventually buy a little bit earlier than they did last time. And that's like the cycles of crypto as it goes up and up and up.
So here's a question for you, and we haven't talked about this. These interruptions, or rather these cycles, and sort of the speculation around Web3 and how people get overexcited about things and maybe then overvalue where we're at or think we're moving faster than we actually are to something that's usable and helpful and has some kind of utility in work and life and business. I'm curious your thoughts on how AI has disrupted the path of Web3 and its entanglement in industries, whether that be music or anything else, any creative thing. Obviously, like since ChatGPT came onto the market, the proliferation of AI has been insane.
Yeah, well, like there's a big thesis that blockchain and AI are closely married because AI is ideally something that needs no trusted intermediary. It's something like I can get value from an AI and I don't need a human being to deliver that value. Okay, so if AIs are going to be truly autonomous, they need to be able to transact value trustlessly without a human intermediary, so thereby blockchains. So I don't think it's disrupted it. I think we're about to see probably the biggest speculative bubble of all of them, which is like AI plus crypto over the next 2-3 years. Like it's going to be nuts.
That's interesting. I'm curious, what do you think that's going to look like?
There's a blockchain called Tau Bit Tensor, and it's a blockchain that's purpose built for AI execution, and it's valued at $2.8 billion today. It went from like $30 to 250, then down to like, or no, to 300, and then it went down to like 190, and then and now it's at like 490 right now. So
Wow.
that's just a warm up. Like the real, like normal people are not interested in Web3 right now. Yeah. So like we're at the bottom, the beginning of a new liquidity cycle, and this type of stuff is already happening. It's only going to get crazier from there, I think.
So with all that said, like what are your predictions for Web3 and music in the next, I don't know, Like, I don't want to say 4 years because that's way too long, even though that's the kind of the cycle that we're talking about here. But like, let's say 1 year and 4 years. Where do you sit in terms of where things are going?
So NFTs last cycle, essentially what they were tokens on a blockchain, just like any other token, except you could put data in those tokens, like you could point to a URL. So anytime you buy an NFT, you are buying a token that in its metadata points to the picture that is on the token that's hosted on a file server somewhere, probably not a decentralized one even.
In Google Drive, dude.
Yeah, the criticism of NFTs is that, like, well, I don't own this picture because it literally lives in a non-decentralized file server, like, and anyone can copy it and all that stuff. And so that was a big criticism of NFTs and music NFTs. Music NFTs just point to the file on a server somewhere.
Right. Yep.
Recently, over the last year, people wanted to start putting NFTs on Bitcoin, which is a fundamentally different type code base, and it operates completely different to most blockchains. And the only way to put things on there is to inscribe things on transactions, to just stuff data where it doesn't actually belong in a transaction. And then now it gets processed in the blockchain. It becomes part of the ledger. And then you can go look up and see, like, oh, they wrote this data on this transaction on this date at this time in this block, and it lives there forever.
This isn't like metadata on a transaction. This is something entirely different.
Yeah, like, so a token on Ethereum is a data structure that exists in a smart contract, which is another data structure. And smart contracts can get put into the data availability of, the blockchain. So in Bitcoin, there is no agreed upon data standards for the structures for like tokens, for NFTs. It's just about sending Bitcoin back and forth. That's all the Bitcoin blockchain does. But if you write a transaction and in a certain field, you just stuff some data, well, that data can now be referenced in the ledger for all time. So you can sort of, you can stuff data in there. And then if we all agree that, like, we're going to transact on this data, like, then it virtually exists. That's all to say that they realized that you can take it like a JPEG or like an image file, and you can convert it into characters, and then you can reconstruct it on the back end. So like if you open a JPEG in a text editor on your computer, like you'll see a bunch of gobbledygook. I can take that gobbledygook and reproduce the JPEG that was there. You can do the same with music files. You can turn it into code, and then you can reconstruct it on the back end. So they just took that code and they stuffed it into a field in a transaction, and voila, you can now go reference, oh, in this transaction, I said that this address owns this picture. Okay. And that's called an inscription. And the thing about inscriptions is that they don't point to a file on a file server. They live on the blockchain. Like the actual file is now inscribed on the chain in this long ledger. It's somewhere in there. And that actually might be something that gives us more like an intellectual property 2.0.
That's interesting.
Because like I could say in court, like, okay, I have this NFT of this song, right? This serves as my copyright because it points to the file and it was on this date, and you can verify it was on this date because blockchains are immutable. So like, it was on this date, or this whole blockchain's fucked, right? Like there's only one of the two. So if we agree this blockchain is not effed, then yes, I made this file on this date. But then you could argue, well, this points to a file stored on a file server. You could have replaced the file. So you could have made the transaction with the link and then replaced the file in a later date.
Right. Yep.
But with inscriptions, that's not the case because the actual data of the file lives there. So inscriptions might actually be an interesting use case for the music industry. I could put a song on the chain, and you can do inscriptions on any chain. They just started on Bitcoin out of necessity. But I could inscribe something on the chain. I could inscribe logic about how, its use should be. I could inscribe logic about where royalties should flow, all that. And it might be interesting, but it would probably take like 5 to 10 years for it to actually be something that people are using day to day. And as usual, like people are like this in the next 2 years, you're going to see people inscribing music, and they are going to claim that this is going to revolutionize the music industry because property rights. And they're going to be wrong because their time frames will be off. Like it's going to take a long time for this stuff to proliferate, for tooling to make it accessible to normal people. Like normal people are not going to go use any of this stuff right now. Like it's way too complex for normal people to use. So it won't become a part of daily life.
We can't even get normies in the music industry to send more than one email in a week.
Yeah, there's no way. So, but you know, you're going to see the hype about music NFTs pop back up like a lot. And music NFTs are stupid. They're dumb. They just are dumb. Like there's no need for them. Like it's entirely clout based that these things exist because we all have to agree that it has value.
Well, again, that goes back to the real or, you know, sort of conspiracy theory idea of why blockchain was appealing to music and the industry in general. It goes back to clout.
Yes, and it goes back to zero interest rate policy, ZIRP. When the United States Federal Reserve says, "Hey, we're cutting interest rates." Lately, over the last 12 years, they've been cutting them to zero, meaning like US Treasury bills get you zero, which means it's very easy to borrow money, which means more money gets created. And right now, we are at a 5.5% federal funds rate. And the whole market is speculating that in March, the Fed will begin a rate cut. And once they do rate cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are not far behind. And so the mania is about to return. The Hypnosis Songs Fund buying Taylor Swift's catalog for $1 trillion. Like it's all coming.
Me refinancing my house.
Yeah. You're going to refi your house at a 2% 30-year fixed mortgage.
Can't wait, dude. Can't wait.
Finally, dude. This guy literally got into the housing market at the top of the interest rate.
Not quite the top. Not
Close to
quite
the top, right? And a few more rate hikes afterwards. But
yeah.
So you're waiting on that refi. You cannot wait.
Yep. Yeah. Super interesting, dude. This is really interesting. It's also very interesting to me what you were just speaking on when it came to inscriptions and intellectual property and copyrights. It all coming back to Bitcoin, at least first, is so interesting to me. It all goes back to Bitcoin.
There's currently a war going on between Bitcoin traditionalist maxis and the people who are propagating inscriptions.
Yeah, I was aware of this.
Yeah, so like they literally call it, people who make NFTs on Bitcoin, which are inscriptions, they call that spamming. They're like, you are spamming the network. This is an attack on the Bitcoin network.
What? Wow.
It's crazy.
Bunch of nerds, dude. That's fascinating though. And it really is interesting that it comes back to Bitcoin like that. Even though, as you mentioned, like this could go on to any chain really.
Yeah, there's now ETH inscriptions. There's Solana inscriptions. It can be done on any chain. It's just a dumb way to do things because these chains were built to do it in a much more economically feasible way. So inscriptions are kind of dumb because they just take up literally Avalanche, a blockchain, like went down and like transactions cost like $200 per transaction because they were doing like an inscription, like a mint or something like that, where they were just doing a bunch of inscriptions. So yeah, inscriptions are incredibly taxing on blockchains and they're a bad way to do things, but they do have these unique properties.
That's crazy because, I mean, for reference, I'm a fairly normie kind of person when it comes to crypto. But when I was doing anything as far as trading goes on Avalanche, it was very fast and very cheap at the time. So it's interesting to hear of a
less than 10 cents per transaction. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
What's interesting about all of that is, I think from what you're saying is like in the short term, that will point to another buzz cycle of NFTs just in a new, built a new way.
This isn't being talked about currently either.
And yeah, not necessarily the longer term or, future outlook of Web3 and music and what it could be.
Yeah. I think Web3 is important for all intellectual property based, it's hard to even say that because of AI.
Yeah.
But like, let's remove AI from the equation. Web3 is a major innovation. Inscriptions are a major innovation for intellectual property and what it could mean in the future. That said, like it's not going to be that important to claim your intellectual property when AI really gets rolling. So take that with a grain of salt.
I think we can wrap up with like a 2-word phrase that you've used before and I've adopted now. It's over.
It's over. It's a wrap.
Dude, thanks for doing this, and thanks for letting me pick your brain
Of course.
and giving the listeners a little bit of a state of the union on Web3 and music and NFTs. I think that it's helpful to touch on this from a balanced, non-hypey point of view, because like anything else in music, like we get overexcited about things and we latch onto them and we think that it's the future and it's the way and that it's going to solve all of our revenue problems when it's probably a little bit further off than that. And I think your perspective on it has always been very even.
Yeah, I will say this though. It would probably pay heavy to go and learn about inscriptions now and see if there's anyone doing music inscriptions and get into music NFTs right now if you're an artist, because like the hype cycle is coming. So
might as well make some money off of it.
Right. Like normies are not involved in Web3 right now, despite like Bitcoin 3xing off of the lows. Normal people are not involved yet. So you can front run all them by going and getting involved now. It's probable that people who are founding protocols for music NFTs, who are, leading teams doing music inscriptions, like these people are all very accessible right now. They're going to become impossible to access in about a year. So
arbitrage.
Go play around now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's good advice. I love it. Thank you so much, dude. Hope you guys dug this. A little bit of a nerdy episode. We'll catch you next time on Creative Juice.
Peace out, y'all.
Peace.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast, feel